Hello, hello. I apologize for this awkward format, and I assure you that I feel somewhat ridiculous. But yes, if you're watching this film, that means once again I've been denied entry into Canada. And while that's ridiculous, absurd, ironic, I don't really want to dwell on it. I don't want to get derailed off into that stupidity. So I'd rather kind of focus on the issue at hand. I was asked to speak a bit about the responsibility or the advisability of scholars, intellectuals, academics entering the public square and speaking on public issues, issues um, of politics, issues of social matter importance. And that's what I intend to do. But I might note at the beginning that I've always considered myself something of a stunt intellectual in the sense that I've always thought of myself, even though I've been a professor at a Research One university, I'm kind of the intellectual that the other intellectuals call when they want to jump off a bridge. That's kind of my job. And I also should note that I'm here with two Chicago filmmakers, Gordon Quinn and Zach Piper, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation because I think it'll be more authentic, more real if we engage in some back and forth. So we'll be doing that. Okay, I want to begin with a kind of discussion about democracy, the spirit and culture of democracy, and the meaning of it for all of us, not just for academics or scholars or intellectuals. And I begin with a little fragment from a poem by Mary Oliver in which she says, she actually calls it Instructions for Living a Life. And it's three simple lines. She says, pay attention, be astonished, and then say something about it. And it seems to me that's really nice advice, not only for living an ordinary life, but living a moral life or being a citizen. And since that applies to all citizens, we have to remind ourselves that we are not simply academics. We do not take off our citizenship when we enter the academy, but we remain citizens. And so that is the responsibility of all of us to open our eyes, to pay attention, to see the world in all of its complexity, to be astonished at what we see, both the pain, the suffering, the unnecessary harm that we do to one another, but also the joy, the ecstasy of living, and then to say something about it, to comment on it. If you think historically for a minute, you realize that for an academic, say, living in the era of slavery, to say, well, my specialty is English literature, I have nothing to say about slavery, is to be morally blind, is to be insanely barricaded against reality. But of course, we know that now. The question is, what are we not seeing today? What are we not opening our eyes to today that's as urgent in terms of the future of the world, of the human race, of all of us, as slavery was back then?
You know, one thing that I'm struck by, Bill, is that the poem, what you said, I mean, your area is education. And in some ways, I think, isn't that also what you say about how educators should look at children or look at whoever they're teaching?
Well, I think it's, the thing I love about that fragment from Mary Oliver is that it is indeed something that I think is universal. I would add one thing to it, and this speaks directly to academics and scholars and intellectuals, and that is, if you take that rhythm, pay attention, open your eyes, recognizing that opening your eyes is not something you could do once in 1940 and then keep them open forever, nor is it something you can do on Monday and have the truth still apply next Sunday. In an infinite, dynamic, ongoing, forward-charging world, opening your eyes is a steady command. It's something that you must do again and again and again. So we open our eyes, we see the world, we're astonished, we're amazed, we're horrified and delighted. Then we speak up. But there's a final requirement, and it's particular to academics and intellectuals, and that is that we have to doubt that what we've seen is all there is to see, or what we've said is all there is to say. That is, we have to be open to the idea that there's still new ideas to come in, new insights, new revelations, new perspectives. And if we avoid that last step, we slip easily into dogma. And that, I think, is the enemy of complexity, of truth, of honesty, and of democratic living. The reason that I want to emphasize that there's nothing precious or special about academics speaking in the public square is because I don't think we should remove ourselves from the general challenge that faces everybody. So, for example, when we talk about academic freedom or the right to speak in the academy, aren't we simply mentioning an instance of free speech? And it seems to me not only are we talking about a particular place of free speech, a kind of free speech, but we shouldn't defend it on the basis of its preciousness, but rather on the basis of its universality. The problem with attacks on academic freedom, which are pretty steady these days and are pretty disheartening, and I think in some ways, not since McCarthyism have we seen such a cold wind blowing through the academy. But the problem with that cold wind isn't just that it silences scholars or academics. The real problem is that it silences everybody else. So after 9/11, when there was this noisy attack on Edward Said and Bill Maher and Susan Sontag, the lesson to the rest of us was, be careful what you say. If we can go after Susan Sontag, or if we can go after Edward Said, what does that mean to the social studies teacher in Nebraska or on the west side of Chicago? They immediately feel and get the message. The message is even the powerful, well-known celebrity intellectuals can be brought down. What chance do you have? And everybody begins to self-censor. So academic freedom is not special or separate from freedom of speech. It's intimately linked. And the reason we need to defend it is precisely because of the effect it has on everybody else. The other thing to say about academic freedom and freedom of speech is that we don't need freedom of speech to protect conventional ideas. It's only the unconventional or pushing the frontiers or entering into discussions about things that unsettle the common sense and the taken for granted. And you see this, again, all the time in the academy and everywhere else. If you lived in the 1830s and you didn't say anything about slavery, or you noted that slavery was the law of the land, that was just normal. It's when you objected to it that you became controversial. The same is true today. If someone speaks about Palestine at Columbia University today, it's controversial. But if an Israeli diplomat comes and speaks in the same place, it's not controversial. And that's the kind of thing we have to worry about. We have to be willing to protect the unconventional ideas precisely because those are the ideas that need to be pushed out. We see this also again and again in language, and this is where I think we need to also, I think, examine a little more closely what's going on. For example, the New York Times, which drives me absolutely off a limb most days, but they reported on a news story on General Electric paying no taxes in the United States, billions of dollars in profits and no taxes. And we learn in the third paragraph that they paid no taxes because of creative bookkeeping. Well, I like creativity, so I'm kind of caught up in the narrative that defends that kind of thing. Or we learn that the bombing and invasion of Libya is called a no-fly zone. Well, a no-fly zone is something that sounds pretty good in the beginning. No-fly, that means less carbon footprint, less airplanes in the air. But it turns out it doesn't mean that at all. So once again, it's the kind of ways in which common sense become this normalizing of absurd ideas and the necessity of all of us, but academics perhaps with a special responsibility to push back against that. I said a minute ago that that a cold wind is kind of blowing in the society, and we're kind of diminishing the public space, and in a way I think that this again is a general problem. That is that the shrinking of the public square is something that should concern everybody, and it gets shrunk in a lot of ways. It gets shrunk because of attacks on some people, but it gets shrunk because we take a kind of anemic view of what democracy is or could be. So when we reduce democracy to procedures and formalities, it actually kills the spirit of democracy.